They said you've changed, that you've become distant, calculating, maybe even cruel. You've heard it in whispers, in tones dripping with moral disappointment. You're so cold now. And yet, you remember what came before that accusation. You remember the exhaustion, the endless giving, the hollow promises that left you drained. The irony is almost poetic. Those who now mourn your coldness are the same ones who once fed on your warmth. You were the open gate, the generous host, the good prince who believed that love was safety. You gave everything, your attention, your time, your compassion, and in return, they left you hollow. You weren't loved, you were plundered. And when the castle of your kindness finally crumbled, when you locked the gates and lit no fires for uninvited guests, they called you heartless. But that's not heartlessness. That's strategy. You see, centuries ago, a Florentine diplomat named Niccolo Machiavelli saw the same tragedy unfold, not in personal relationships but in the courts of power. In The Prince, he wrote that the ruler who seeks to be loved above all will soon be betrayed by the same hearts he tried to please. Love, he said, is a bond that people break whenever it suits them. Fear, or rather, respect, endures. It is much safer, he warned, to be feared than loved. But what he really meant is this: affection is conditional, but consequence is eternal. You're not becoming cruel, you're becoming sovereign. What they call coldness is your initiation into power, the rebirth of your own virtù, that inner command, that unshakable ability to govern yourself rather than be governed by others' moods. You've probably noticed how the world romanticizes vulnerability, how every book, every post, every half-baked healing mantra tells you to open your heart, to forgive endlessly, to keep loving no matter what. But they never tell you what happens to the one who opens their gates to everyone. They don't tell you that empathy without boundaries becomes self-erasure. They don't tell you that those who cannot say no are the ones who end up begging for scraps of respect. This isn't enlightenment, it's enslavement. And Machiavelli, in his brutal honesty, refused to lie about it. He spoke not to the victims, but to the rulers, not to those who seek pity, but to those who crave freedom. His lesson wasn't about cruelty, but about control, about the quiet, strategic kind of strength that stops bleeding for those who keep cutting. Stay with me, because what I'm about to say will probably challenge everything you were taught about being a good person. Love, as most people understand it, is one of the weakest currencies of power. It binds you not through truth, but through expectation. To be loved, you must constantly perform. You must keep the peace, avoid conflict, please others. You must suppress your anger, your limits, your clarity, all to maintain a fragile sense of belonging. But love built on obligation is a debt that never stops collecting. And here's the Machiavellian truth. Most people, when the cost of loving you outweighs the benefits, will quietly withdraw their affection. They will turn on you, not because you changed, but because the transaction no longer serves them. You know this. You've seen it in relationships where your generosity became invisible the moment you stopped giving. You've seen it at work, when your silence was mistaken for consent. You've seen it in friendships where your niceness became a tool others used to avoid accountability. They loved you as long as you were useful. But love that evaporates when you draw a boundary isn't love. It's dependency disguised as virtue. And so, when you began to pull back, when you decided to protect what's left of your energy, they called you cold. That word, cold, is simply their way of saying, you stopped being easy to exploit. Machiavelli warned that love is fragile because it depends on the honesty of others, and people are rarely honest when their comfort is at stake. They will praise your kindness while plotting how to benefit from it. They will urge you to forgive so they never have to change. They will weaponize your empathy, making you feel guilty for not giving them what they want. That's not connection. That's manipulation. The illusion is that love keeps you safe, but in reality, love makes you predictable. And the predictable are the easiest to control. There's a darker truth beneath this, one most people never face. Every time you've been drained by others, it wasn't because you lacked kindness, it was because you lacked strategy. You were living at the mercy of fortuna, as Machiavelli called it, the unpredictable tide of circumstance, emotion, and other people's whims. Fortuna is chaos in disguise, the sudden betrayal, the shifting loyalty, the emotional weather you can't control. And when you base your peace on being loved, you're surrendering your entire kingdom to that chaos. Every compliment, every apology, every ounce of affection becomes a dice roll. You feel strong one day and discarded the next. That's not love, that's servitude. Your exhaustion, your cynicism, your so-called coldness, these are not signs of decay. They're signs that your Virtù is waking up. Virtù doesn't mean virtue in the moral sense. It means skill, courage, mastery, the capacity to act according to your own will instead of waiting for permission. When you became cold, you were not shutting down your heart. You were reclaiming the throne of your mind. You were realizing that the world doesn't reward purity, it rewards clarity. That being endlessly available only makes you invisible. That silence, when chosen deliberately, can be a weapon sharper than any outburst. Think of Virtù as the dam you build against the flood of fortuna. While the world begs for your emotional openness, you're learning the art of containment. You're redirecting the river instead of drowning in it. Every no you say, every boundary you enforce, every moment you choose silence over explanation, these are not acts of coldness. They're acts of construction. You're building walls, not to isolate yourself, but to protect the sanctity of your own state. Because when the flood comes again, and it always does, you'll no longer be washed away. And yet, there's another layer to this, one that separates true power from bitterness. Machiavelli never glorified cruelty. He warned that to be hated is fatal. What he praised was the kind of fear that breeds respect, the quiet authority that comes from predictable consequence. Before, there was no consequence to disrespecting you. People could dismiss your needs, drain your time, take your kindness for granted, and you'd still forgive, still stay, still try to fix it. That's why they didn't respect you. They didn't fear losing you, but now your absence has weight. Your silence costs them comfort. Your distance teaches them what your words never could. That's not cruelty. That's command. And if this is resonating, if you can feel that silent shift inside you, stay with me. Because understanding your Virtù is only the beginning. What comes next is the strategy of maintaining it without turning to stone. You're not meant to be unfeeling. You're meant to be unmanipulable. And that's a very different thing. Every great ruler learns this paradox sooner or later, that compassion without strength becomes an invitation for chaos. You once believed that kindness would make people treat you better, that generosity would inspire reciprocity, that openness would earn loyalty. But the world doesn't work that way. The world respects limits, not longing. Those who once took your warmth for granted have now met a version of you that doesn't beg, doesn't explain, doesn't chase. They call this version cold because it's the first one that refuses to be controlled. What they truly fear is not your silence, it's your sovereignty. Machiavelli understood this psychological truth better than any modern therapist. When people realize they can no longer manipulate you through affection, they will call you arrogant. When they realize they can no longer guilt you into submission, they will call you selfish. And when they realize they can no longer predict you, they will call you cold. These are not insults, they're reports. They're signals that your emotional currency is no longer circulating in their economy. You've pulled your investment out of people who never earned it. And as their comfort dissolves, they mistake their withdrawal symptoms for your cruelty. Here's what's really happening. You're teaching others what consequence feels like. Not through revenge, not through outburst, but through absence. The coldness they feel is the temperature of accountability. You no longer reward inconsistency. You no longer negotiate with disrespect. And in a world that confuses tolerance with virtue, that level of discipline feels subversive. It unsettles people who were nourished by your compliance. It exposes how much of their love was actually dependency. Your silence is a mirror now, and what they see in it frightens them. But there's another layer beneath this awakening, the distinction between being feared and being hated. Machiavelli warned that hatred destroys authority because it breeds rebellion. A ruler must never make people feel humiliated or exploited. Fear, in the Machiavellian sense, is not terror, it's certainty. It's the understanding that boundaries are real, that actions have consequences, that respect is not optional. When people know where you stand, they adapt. When your reactions are consistent, they recalibrate. That's the essence of being feared, not through cruelty, but through stability. When others realize that your peace cannot be bought or manipulated, you become immovable. Think about it. Before, every time someone crossed a line, you explained, justified, softened your stance. You thought communication would fix it. But communication without consequence is just theater. It gives the illusion of resolution without the reality of change. That's why now you've learned the value of silence, not as a withdrawal, but as a verdict. Silence is the sword of the strategist. It cuts through noise without spilling blood. When you go quiet, the manipulator loses their stage. When you stop explaining, the opportunist loses their leverage. When you stop seeking understanding, the takers reveal themselves. This is what your coldness truly is, emotional precision. Machiavelli would call it Virtù, your ability to control not others, but yourself. To shape your reactions as a craftsman shapes steel. Virtù is not a feeling. It's an architecture of power built from your restraint. Every controlled silence, every deliberate no, every decision to disengage from drama is a brick in that fortress. You no longer live in reaction to fortuna, to the unpredictable tides of others' approval. You live by design. You no longer ask, will they like me? You ask, does this align with my state? And in that single shift, your life begins to reorganize itself. But here's the danger. When you first discover this strength, it's tempting to overcorrect, to turn your armor into ice. You start confusing protection with punishment. You stop trusting warmth altogether. This is the shadow side of Virtù, the risk of becoming emotionally sterile. Machiavelli never intended for the prince to be cruel. He intended him to be effective. And effectiveness requires discernment, knowing when to extend the hand, when to withdraw it, and when to simply stand still. To rule yourself wisely, you must never let defense become domination. Power without mercy decays into paranoia. Strategy without empathy turns you into the very tyrant you once fled. So how do you balance it? By remembering that Virtù is not about being untouchable. It's about being unshakable. You don't have to stop caring. You just have to stop collapsing. You can still love, still connect, still give, but only from choice, never from fear. The moment your giving becomes a strategy of survival, it ceases to be noble. Love should be a gift, not a bribe. When you stop offering it as currency, it becomes sacred again. If you've ever felt the tension between your desire for peace and your need for power, that's the soul of this transformation. You're learning what Machiavelli tried to teach rulers centuries ago, that mercy and might are not opposites, but partners. True sovereignty doesn't come from suppressing your emotions. It comes from mastering them. When you can look at your anger and say, "You serve me now." When you can sit with your loneliness without running back to those who broke you. When you can hold your silence and still feel full. That's when your Virtù matures. You start seeing relationships differently. You stop chasing people to prove your worth. You start noticing who respects your distance instead of resenting it. You realize that being cold isn't about rejection. It's about calibration. You're adjusting the temperature of your life to something sustainable. The frantic warmth that once burned you out is replaced by a steady internal fire, not visible to everyone, but indestructible. People may say you've changed, but what's really changed is the balance of power. They can no longer read you like an open book because you've rewritten the language. Still, The transformation is not without cost. There will be moments when your solitude feels heavy, when you wonder if you've gone too far, if perhaps they were right, if maybe you've become too cold. But that's the illusion speaking again, the ghost of the old self whispering through the cracks of your armor. Let it speak, but don't obey. Because on the other side of that discomfort is peace, a peace that doesn't depend on anyone else's approval. And that's the moment you begin to rule your own state, the point where boundaries stop feeling like walls and start feeling like architecture. You're not cutting people off. You're constructing an empire of equilibrium. There's more to uncover: how to maintain this power without losing your humanity, how to use coldness not as defense but as diplomacy. Because in the next layer of this transformation lies the art of strategy itself, the practice of leading your own life the way a wise ruler leads a kingdom. To understand the art of ruling your own life, you must first accept that every human interaction is political. Not in the sense of deceit or manipulation, but in the way every conversation, every choice, every silence becomes a negotiation of power. You are the sovereign of a small but sacred territory: your mind, your time, your emotional landscape. Every request that reaches you is a diplomatic mission. Every favor asked, every apology given, every demand disguised as concern, they are all negotiations with your inner state. Before, when you sought to be loved, you gave away these resources like a naive ruler handing out gold to keep the peace. But peace bought with self-betrayal is the most expensive kind. What you called harmony was simply occupation. Now you understand that leadership begins in solitude. Machiavelli wrote that a wise ruler strengthens his fortifications before the invasion, not during it. That's what your coldness truly is: preventative strategy. You no longer wait for someone to cross your boundaries to realize you have them. You no longer wait to be burned to recognize fire. You act in times of calm, constructing your limits with precision. These are your barricades, your policies, your treaties of self-respect. You plan your defenses not out of fear, but out of respect for your own resources, because your time is your treasury. Your energy is your army, and your silence is your weapon of peace. Think of it this way: you are no longer reactive, you are proactive. You do not need to declare war to protect your state. You need only to know where your borders begin and end. This is what it means to live with Virtù, to act not out of impulse, but intention. You decide when to speak, when to withdraw, when to open your gates, and when to close them. You understand that mercy must be measured, not endless. Because unchecked compassion becomes chaos, and chaos always invites invasion. The coldness others resent is simply your refusal to let chaos back in. But Machiavelli also warned about appearances. He knew that the ruler who is too honest about his strategies invites rebellion, so he advised the prince to appear merciful, loyal, humane, while keeping his judgment intact. A ruler, he wrote, must know how to act as both man and beast. This isn't hypocrisy, it's adaptability. In the world of power, perception is protection. So what does that mean for you? It means your warmth must become tactical, not habitual. You no longer give kindness indiscriminately, because indiscriminate kindness is indistinguishable from weakness. You choose when to be soft, not because you fear being judged, but because you understand its strategic value. This is the economy of coldness. You no longer need to be cold. You simply need to command it, like a weapon you carry but rarely draw. You use it not to hurt, but to signal that you could, if pushed. That is what generates respect, not cruelty, but capability. When people sense that your boundaries are backed by consequence, they treat your kindness as privilege, not entitlement. And in this balance between appearance and essence, you become powerful without losing your humanity. You might notice that this transformation shifts your relationships dramatically. Some people disappear, not because you've wronged them, but because they thrived in the old version of you. Others begin to approach you differently. They measure their words, respect your time, honor your silence. This is not loneliness. This is filtration. The ones who remain are those who value your equilibrium more than their convenience. The ones who leave are those who fed on your chaos. Your coldness is simply your filter doing its job. Still, Machiavelli's greatest warning remains: avoid hatred. To rule wisely, you must never use power to humiliate. You do not weaponize your boundaries to make others feel small. You do not turn silence into punishment. The goal of strategy is not domination, but preservation. The prince is feared because he protects his people. He is hated only when he exploits them. Likewise, your self-protection must never become predation. If your coldness begins to seek revenge instead of balance, it will corrupt you. Your walls will become prisons. Power without compassion decays into paranoia, and soon you'll start defending yourself against ghosts instead of real threats. So here is the discipline. Be firm, but never cruel. Withdraw access, but never dignity. Refuse exploitation, but never humanity. The moment your strength humiliates another, it stops being strength and becomes insecurity in disguise. You do not need to prove your power. Your stillness already does that. True sovereignty speaks softly. And when you master that balance, something miraculous happens. People begin to respect you not because they fear punishment, but because they sense coherence. Your presence feels organized. Your boundaries are not sharp, but defined. You become the calmest person in chaotic rooms. You no longer need to argue to assert yourself. Your energy does it for you. The same people who once tested your patience now lower their tone when they speak to you. Not because they're intimidated, but because they sense order. And human beings, even the unruly ones, instinctively respect order. This is the silent power Machiavelli alluded to, the kind that doesn't roar but reshapes the air. The power of the ruler who governs himself so completely that the world adjusts around him. It's not arrogance. It's alignment. It's not detachment. It's dominion. And the paradox is that the colder you appear on the surface, the more peace burns underneath, because your warmth is no longer for sale. If this resonates, stay with me, because now we step into the final truth, the quiet glory that comes after all the strategy, all the silence, all the restraint, the moment where coldness transforms from armor into aura, and you realize that being called cold was never an insult. It was a coronation. There comes a moment in every transformation when the silence inside you no longer feels like distance. It feels like sovereignty. That's when you realize that peace is not the absence of conflict. It's the presence of control. You no longer wake up wondering who's upset with you, who misunderstood you, who's pulling away. You've stopped performing emotional acrobatics for people who never noticed your effort. Instead, your life begins to resemble a well-governed state, stable, deliberate, self-sustaining. You don't rush to fix what others break. You don't chase what refuses to stay. You've become the ruler Machiavelli imagined, firm, respected, misunderstood by those who still live enslaved to approval. When you reach this stage, your old instincts still whisper. They tell you to explain yourself, to soften your stance, to assure others you're still good. But goodness, you've learned, was the disguise of your servitude. It wasn't goodness they loved, it was your compliance. They loved your availability, not your virtue. They loved your warmth because it made them comfortable. Now, your calm makes them uneasy. Your silence feels like a threat because it's the sound of self-possession. What they call cold is simply the temperature of dignity. You've learned to move differently. You no longer respond to emotional bait. You no longer confuse kindness with debt. You've become selective, not cynical, just conscious. Your time has become precious because you finally recognize it as currency. You spend it only where there is mutual respect, where your presence is not a convenience, but a privilege. People sense this shift even if they can't name it. They start hesitating before asking for favors. They lower their voices when they speak to you. It's not fear, it's reverence. They're responding to the structure you built, the quiet discipline of a mind that no longer bleeds for validation. Machiavelli would say that this is the mark of a true sovereign, to inspire respect not through intimidation, but through inevitability. Your decisions are no longer reactive. They are declarations. Your no carries the weight of law because you no longer explain it. Your boundaries are no longer negotiations. They're geography. People don't argue with the mountain, they adjust to its presence. That's you now. The world moves around your stillness. And something else happens, something subtle but profound. The noise inside your mind quiets. You begin to hear yourself again. The voice that once trembled with guilt now speaks with calm authority. You no longer crave applause because you no longer mistake attention for respect. You've stopped advertising your goodness. You're too busy embodying your integrity. The space that once felt empty without validation now feels sacred. It's where your energy returns to you. It's where your intuition sharpens. It's where your virtù replenishes itself. This is what liberation feels like. Not the euphoria of rebellion, but the serenity of control. You realize that you don't owe everyone access. You don't owe everyone understanding. You don't owe anyone the constant warmth that once exhausted you. You give where it aligns, not where it's demanded. You connect where it's reciprocated, not where it's convenient. You finally understand that love without respect is just flattery, and forgiveness without consequence is permission for repeat offense. Now observe what happens around you. Chaos begins to repel itself. People who thrive on drama find you intolerable. They can't read you, can't provoke you, can't use you as fuel. Your composure exposes their dependency. You become the quiet center of their storm. And storms cannot survive without movement. They drift away, seeking softer ground. Meanwhile, those who value balance gravitate toward you. They sense that your peace is contagious. That's the true influence of the cold one, not to dominate, but to regulate. You become a thermostat for your environment, not a thermometer reacting to its temperature. And here's the paradox. The more cold you appear, the more magnetic you become, because true confidence doesn't chase. It attracts. People trust those who cannot be easily swayed. They admire those who do not beg for belonging. Your detachment becomes intrigue. Your calm becomes charisma. The same silence they once called intimidating now feels sacred. They come to you not for validation, but for grounding. You become the person whose presence restores equilibrium, the one others instinctively respect without understanding why. This is sovereignty, the final stage of the transformation. The state Machiavelli hinted at, but never named, because it isn't about ruling others, but ruling oneself. It's the realization that you are both the kingdom and the crown. The battles you fought were never against people, but against your own compulsion to please. The victory was not in making others fear you, but in teaching yourself not to fear their withdrawal. That's what power truly is, not domination, but detachment. The ability to walk away from anything that threatens your inner order. Now, the world will still misunderstand you. They'll still call you cold, distant, maybe even arrogant. But you'll hear those words differently. They won't sting anymore. Because you'll understand that these are the sounds of boundaries solidifying. They're the echoes of people mourning the loss of unearned access. They don't miss you, they miss their influence over you. Every accusation of coldness is an acknowledgement of control reclaimed. It's the proof that you've transitioned from servant to strategist, from victim to sovereign, from warmth without direction to presence with purpose. And perhaps that's the ultimate irony, that what they perceive as emotional death is actually rebirth. The warmth they mourn hasn't vanished. It's simply been rerouted inward to sustain you instead of deplete you. It glows now from behind your composure, steady and contained, like the hearth of a well-guarded castle. You've become the keeper of your own fire. And the world, whether it loves or fears you, must now respect its light from a distance. So the next time someone tells you you've become cold, smile quietly, let them say it. Because they're not describing your downfall, they're describing your ascension. They're witnessing the moment when the fool who begged for affection finally disappeared, and the strategist who commands respect took his place. You didn't become cold. You became calculated. You became clear. You became the ruler of yourself. And the world has no defense against that kind of power.